Hi, my name is Ceridwen Hughes and I'm the director and founder of Same But Different. With Same But Different, we use the arts to create greater awareness of rare disease and disability. And what we actually do is use photographs, video and narratives to introduce people to the person behind the rare disease and disability. So we don't just focus on their disease or condition, we focus on them, their personalities, what they like, that sort of thing. Because often somebody sees a rare disease or they see the disability and forget that actually it's a person and it's just the same as everybody else. They just may have a disease or a disability that might affect them slightly differently. The reason I set up Same But Different was my own son, Isaac, who's now 11, was born with a rare disease called Moebius syndrome. With Moebius syndrome, it affects the facial nerves, so you have paralysis of the face, you can't look left or right with your eyes, and usually you have other aspects to it. So for example, Isaac has small hands, he was very low muscle tone when he was born, he couldn't suck properly, and there's all sorts of different aspects to it. We'd never heard of Moebius syndrome when he was born, and it was 8 months actually until we had a diagnosis for his condition. And those 8 months were really long and quite stressful and difficult, and they were something that I'm sure that many other people waiting for a rare disease diagnosis can empathise with. So Isaac was born after a normal pregnancy. We didn't expect anything else to go wrong. We thought that everything was fine. He was quite small in weight, but nothing to really concern us. But he had difficulty feeding, and for the first sort of afternoon, everything was fine. But they started to get more concerned as the day went on. So they took him away to special care unit in the evening so that they could feed him through a tube. And whilst we were concerned, we weren't overly concerned. We just assumed that it was because he was perhaps a little bit early or low birth weight, but we weren't overly concerned. And it was only the next day when the consultant came in with his entourage, and he sort of breezed into the room and looked over Isaac and said, well, you know, we're a bit concerned. He's got epicanthal fold. He has a line on his palm that we didn't know anything about, and a few other little things. He said that we're actually going to do some genetic tests. It could be that he has a chromosomal problem, it could be that he has a genetic condition, or it could just be that he's a strange looking child. Now, to us as parents, we never even thought for a minute that he was a strange looking child. He was just our baby boy, you know, he looked like any other little baby. And the use of those words were really difficult for us. And in fact, I even sent my husband home to get some other photos of our other son to just sort of compare and contrast. And because it was 8 months for a diagnosis, I just spent a lot of that time thinking, is he a strange looking child? I'd even ask a friend, you know, does he look different? Is he strange? It really was just a throwaway sentence to the consultant. But to us as parents, it had a really profound, it just affected the way that we saw him. And it was just such a very difficult time anyway, that to constantly be looking at our child and thinking, how do people see him? Do they see him as different? Made it a very difficult journey. We actually got a diagnosis for Isaac when he was 8 months old. We had a normal appointment at the consultants, and so we weren't actually expecting to get a diagnosis at all. We went in and he did all the usual checkups with Isaac, and it, you know, throughout the 8 months it had been a difficult and long journey. We had no answers. We'd been to a few appointments. He had very much a profound squint, so we'd been to see an eye surgeon to look at his eyes, but we didn't actually expect to get a diagnosis at this appointment. And we went in, and as I say, he did the usual checkups, and then said that he had a diagnosis and that Isaac would have Moebius syndrome, and that he was basically, as he had facial paralysis, and there was nothing they could do, so we could just go home. And he didn't actually give us any information. He didn't give us any information of any support groups. He didn't tell us any details at all. And in fact, we even had to ask him to write down the name Moebius because we didn't know how to spell it. And then we were just sent home. There was no follow-up appointment. There was nothing. And so, of course, we did what everybody else does, and that's Google Moebius. And we just... It was horrendous, actually, because there were so many really bad photos of very poorly looking people and paralysis, and you just thought, is this the future? Is this it? And so we had very little to go on, and there isn't actually a support organisation in the UK for Moebius at all either. So there was an organisation in America, and so we got in touch with them, but there was really nothing. There was no information. We knew nothing about his condition other than he had facial paralysis. And so that left us with two problems. One, our child's got facial paralysis and this rare disease called Moebius syndrome. We knew nothing about rare diseases. We didn't know where to go or anything. But we were also left with, how do we tell people? Because we know nothing about it ourselves. So how do we tell friends and family that our child has this rare disease when we knew so little? So we had to, as I say, research it ourselves. We had to put together a sort of almost like a picture of what the condition would mean. But because we'd been given no information, because we knew nothing about it, we didn't know how it would affect on him day to day. And actually a month later he nearly died because we didn't realise it affected the tongue movement. And as such, he was on, foods that were quite soft and easy to eat at that age, but because he didn't have such good tongue movement, we gave him a biscuit for a 3-month-old. In fact, it was near enough Christmas time, and I was making mince pies. I can remember exactly what I was doing, and Isaac was helping. Theo was helping me. He was 3 at the time, and Isaac choked on this child's biscuit because it was too claggy, and he started to go blue, and it was just horrendous. I was actually useless in that situation. There was just me and Isaac and Theo in the house, and I had to call an ambulance. I couldn't even remember the address. It was just total panic. And Isaac was, as I say, going blue and struggling to breathe. Luckily, I managed to get him breathing again. And so when the ambulance came, which was actually 25 minutes later, it was all fine by then. But it was a really scary and stressful thing. And had we known, had the consultant told us that there was a problem with the tongue movement, it's something that we could have looked out for. But because we had no information at all, it was life-threatening. And so there's many reasons why better diagnosis need to be given. One is to make sure that people know what they're dealing with, and secondly, so that nobody feels completely and utterly left alone to cope with that sort of situation. After then, we started to build our own team of consultants. We spoke to speech therapy, got a food specialist. We rang around and spoke to different consultants to see if they'd ever treated anyone with Moebius before. We basically built our own team. I would speak to a consultant, and if they'd seen 1 or 2 children with Moebius, that was generally considered to be, really knowledgeable. So I would ask if we could refer to them. And so we ended up with a team of people who could give us some advice. But that was with a lot of hard work, a lot of effort, and I suppose the confidence that I would be able to speak to the different consultants. I think it's very difficult because not everyone feels or knows how to go about it, and that's why it's very important that there's more support for people with rare diseases. I think for us, one of the hardest aspects of the condition that Isaac has is that he looks different. People make assumptions based on the way he looks, and I know that's the same for a lot of people with disabilities or rare diseases. And I think cognitively, you see, it doesn't really affect Isaac that much. He is affected by dyspraxia, so he finds it harder to process things, or longer. It takes longer to process things. But on the whole, cognitively, he's really fine. But people look at him and they see his facial paralysis and they see the way he looks, and they make assumptions based on that. So, you know, there's been many situations where people have come up to us and said, oh, you know, what special school does your son go to? Not even talking to Isaac himself, and just talking to me. And he doesn't go to a special school, he goes to a mainstream school. He does all the subjects that everybody else does. He you know, gets on with life. And so it's very difficult because of those assumptions that people make. And funny enough, I read Wonder, the book, a few years ago now. And when I read it, I would sit there, and it was really, really, really a very good book, but it did affect me a lot when I was reading it. And I would sit there, and my husband would walk in and he'd go, oh, you're reading that book again? And I'd be going, yeah, so I'm reading the book again. Because it really, I was just crying for most pages of it. But I liked it so much because it addressed the things that we, in a small way, felt that we went through. So, you know, things that people are judging, people making decisions, people just making assumptions based around the way somebody looked. And, you know, in this case, it was our son. And so I bought, probably over the years, maybe about 25 copies of this book, and I've given it to various people that are involved in Isaac's care or in his school or things like that, because I just thought it was such an important book. And so when the film came out, I thought, oh, you know, I couldn't wait to see the film, but at the same time I worried about how I'd react to it. And actually I sat there when I watched the film and I sobbed. I sobbed throughout the whole thing, from the beginning to the end. And when it finished, I left, and I actually looked like a great big tomato with this very red face, and I felt so sorry for the people sitting next to me, because they probably had no idea why I was sitting there sobbing throughout this whole film. But I thought it was a really good film and a really important film, and the underlying sentiment of be kind was something that I think that we all hope and wish for people when they're dealing with our children, that we just ultimately want acceptance and for people to be kind. So, you know, just, it doesn't matter what somebody looks like. And in fact, a few years ago when Isaac was in primary school, there was a little girl came up to me one day and said, actually, it doesn't matter. Isaac might look different to the rest of us, but inside he's exactly the same. And that, I think, is something that is a message that's carried through this film that is really important, and it is be kind, and that's all we want and all we wish for everybody dealing with our children and other people with rare diseases as well. And so ultimately it's an important film, it's an important book, and one that I think hopefully you'll all enjoy.